Right. So, hello everyone here and everyone out there watching us on stream. So, my name is Åge Borchgrevink, and as most of you know, I'm a senior advisor with the Norwegian Helsinki Committee. And welcome to you all to a meeting with Luke Harding. I think most
Hello,
of you
everybody.
know
Hello.
him. Yes,
Hi.
he's sitting right there. And of course, he's one of the most prominent European journalist writers of our time, if I may say so. You can now blush if you want, or
I
maybe
don't know.
you're just too tired to blush.
I don't know if it's true, but I'm a bit tired, so I'll just take it.
Right.
Okay.
We will be talking about your book, Invasion, your Russia's bloody war and Ukraine's fight for survival. But I'd also like to delve into some of your other books, and we agreed to keep it going for maybe 30 minutes or so, and then maybe if there are questions, they are welcome, especially the good ones, and not so many comments, please. No comments. Because it's also interesting, your books, they make sort of a catalog of some of the greatest news stories of our time, basically. You were there at the right times, you could say.
Yes. By the way, am I allowed to swear on this thing or not? Tell me. I mean, are the kids watching, or is it just grown-ups?
As long as you keep it in English, you know,
is
and
it
not
okay?
in Norwegian, it will be okay.
Well, I mean, you're right. I mean, I have one major theme has been Russia and Russia's transformation into this revisionist. Well, we can talk about this, but I would say fascist power. But when I was writing the most recent book, Invasion, in 2022. And we were talking earlier about how some people in the Norwegian foreign policy community thought we had to make peace with Russia and not provoke Russia. Anyway, then the full-scale invasion happened, and my wife said, "Don't call it invasion. Call it I fucking told you so." But I mean, you know, to be serious, I mean, you know, we did, and for a while, a lot of people didn't want to listen. I mean, both policymakers and some think tankers, and even some commentators in the US who believe that the answer is to make peace with Russia. And someone called Donald Trump, if you've heard of him.
Oh, there was some guy. Yeah. Well, right. Yes, this is true. We met, I guess, first time I think just 10 years ago when the war in Ukraine had started, but it was not generally seen as a war at that time everywhere. It was interpreted as some kind of murky civil war thing. And I was moderating then a panel with Luke and some others, and you really managed to rile them up pretty good, I remember. So I was really happy about it because they were angry with you and not with me at that time.
Well, I mean, it wasn't the way I was with Sophie Oksanen, I think.
Yes, Sophie Oksanen,
the Finnish writer, novelist. It was merely that I'd been there. I'd been in. We're talking about Ukraine, but I'd been in Donetsk and Luhansk in the spring of 2014. When the Russians took over, and it was absolutely clear to me that this was a large-scale covert military takeover involving all arms of the Russian state, the Russian army, of course, but also military intelligence, the FSB, the Kremlin, and so on. And the idea this was just a civil war was crazy. I mean, where did they get the tanks from? And when you were driving around eastern Ukraine during those days, you would go to a sort of small mining town, and you would see local guys manning a rubbish checkpoint with a few tires and a baseball bat. And you drive the same road 3 days later, and there was a military constructed professional checkpoint with new people with balaclavas with brand new uniforms and Kalashnikovs. And you could see the whole operation being professionalized. So then when I love Norway. You come to Norway and someone tells you you've misunderstood, you just feel like clonking them. I mean, obviously I wouldn't, you know, but you can see our exasperation because, of course, we were right.
You come here directly from Ukraine. You said Kiev, of course, yesterday. And
about 5 minutes ago.
And met Zelensky a couple of days ago.
I saw Zelensky on Friday in the presidential palace.
But I'd like to ask you, but before that, or at least the dispatches I read from you just recently, they are from Pokrovsk. So it's one of the central front lines in eastern Ukraine now. And of course, I think most of us read news, and also from the town of Vuhledar, for instance, of the Russians marching on. Can you tell us a little bit about what is going on right there, or your impressions now?
Yeah, I mean, basically, the Russian military has been going forward. I mean, it's been going forward incrementally since last autumn, but things picked up in February when there was what you might call a strategic retreat by Ukrainian armed forces from Avdiivka. And I was on the front line in Avdiivka just before the full-scale invasion with Ukrainian troops in January of 2022, and they held out for 2 years, and then eventually they got overwhelmed, and then ever since Russia has been pushing forward. And Pokrovsk, which is this town in the western part of Donetsk Oblast, quite close to the border with Dnipro, it was always this hub where you would go to more dangerous places, and you go to Pokrovsk because it was a bit safer, it was further from the front line, they had quite good pizza. There was a terrible hotel we stayed in called the Druzhba with a really grumpy, rather Soviet receptionist, right. Which of course then tragically got bombed, although I think by that point it had shut down. And people in Pokrovsk sort of, they knew the war was close, but they didn't think it directly concerned them. And of course what the Russians have been doing is they've been advancing pretty rapidly over the last couple of months. So when I was in Pokrovsk a week ago, I spent time with the 15th Brigade of the National Guard, who were fighting just outside, was watching live surveillance footage of platoons of Russian soldiers on foot going through no man's land, walking through a village called Mikhailovka, through a graveyard. And drones are tracking them. One guy hiding under a tree, another guy here then gets hit by a drone, and then his leg doesn't work, and I'm watching as he's sort of bottom shuffling, to his death.
The stuff we see on social media.
But the stuff you see on social media, but this was actually happening in front of me. I mean, this wasn't on social media. It was the brigade was saying they kill 100 Russians a day, and the battlefield this is just one brigade, lined with Russian corpses. Looking at an anti-tank trench with 20 guys there, machine guns, provisions, all dead. Other guys next to the graveyard, and the problem is it's not quality. Russia is not fighting smart, it's quantity, and a willingness on behalf of the Kremlin and the Russian sort of general staff to sacrifice tens of thousands of soldiers for really quite micro goals, and combined with air power, glide bombs, artillery, they are slowly but surely grinding down, flattening Ukrainian positions to the point where when I was in Pokrovsk, the Russians were 6 miles away. And war is noisy. It's strange. You go through town and it's quite quiet and a bit spooky because most people have left, and then you hear boom, boom, boom from artillery. Most of it probably outgoing, but some of it incoming. And when I got there, the Russians had blown all the bridges, so that we tottered over very gingerly. Half of the bridge had been destroyed, and we drove over the remaining half. Meanwhile, a whole lot of engineers in orange jackets are trying to build a kind of makeshift road over the railway. Banks are shut. And then, of course, you go to the market, and it's full of people who are still there, who refuse to leave, particularly old people, people on bicycles, buying produce. And then I was with evacuation teams with a woman I wrote about who was, leaving her family home, which had been in the family for 4 generations. And, this was the story I wrote for The Guardian. So her daughter's furry bear came with, some slippers stayed. The Ukrainian alphabet wall chart stayed. The pickled cucumbers came with. The microwave came with.
The choices you have to make.
And the dog, this annoying dog, came too. Labrador. And you just see people's lives are, they have an existence. They have a vegetable patch. They have a vine. They have pairs. They have friends. They have network. And everything is devoured, and this is what Russia is doing. I mean, it's not just. It is about territory, but it's what Russia is inheriting in the east is nothing. I mean, there's no this village Mikhailovka. There's no one living there. It's all flattened.
They make a desert and call it peace.
They make a desert and call it victory. Actually, they call it victory, and they plant a flag in the ruins, and it looks okay on Russian TV. They get someone to say how wonderful Russia is, and so they move on. And it is a dark, grim, fascist project taking place in Europe in our time. And we can't look away. We need to, I mean, you're not looking away. People in this room on a live stream are not looking away, but we need to give it our attention, our moral sense, our compassion, because the war is not finishing soon, unfortunately. It's not going to finish this year, and I think Vladimir Putin still thinks he can win.
And for Norway, not only compassion, but maybe money too would be nice.
You guys are still rich, right? You're almost the last rich country in Europe, so don't give you your money, but give Ukraine some of your money.
Right.
I would humbly suggest, if that's not too.
I think it's a good. I think we'll take it from here and try to bring on the message. I think you just also by your stories you said something also about your books, because they really contain this. What Martha Gellern said, the view from the ground. I mean, the stories about people. I think this is really what lifts your all your books, but also this invasion. This was really sticks when you read them.
They have to be the Ukrainians are the heroes of this war. I mean, not that they want to be heroes. They just want peace. They want to have a normal life of the kind that we all enjoy and take for granted. But obviously you have to tell the story of the politics. But I also wanted to tell the story of accidental people, who got swept up in all this. Also older people. I mean, there's something wonderfully stubborn about some old people. I mean, I was just when I was in Pokrovsk with this woman Natasha. Then her neighbour came out, Nikolai, and was sort of about 70 years old and lighting a cigarette. And I said, well, Nikolai, what's your plan, man? What are you going to do? Look, boom, boom, boom. Your neighbour's going, what are you going to do? And then he said, I don't think the Russians will touch me. And I said, are you sure? And then he said, maybe I will leave later. And it was just
that was the plan.
Yeah, and it's just there's this absolute reluctance, which I understand, of people leaving. But there were also, I met other evacuation teams who've been in a city called Ukrainsk, which has now fallen. It's fallen in the last week, 8 days.
Okay.
And the Ukrainian soldiers come around and they say, look, you got to leave. And then one woman says, I'm not going to leave. I don't want to leave. And of course, that night, 2 Russian soldiers come into the building. They're with the civilians in the cellar. There's a firefight, and the woman is killed. And the next thing, it's her body lying on the street. And it's impossible choices. It's impossible choices of the kind that really people in Europe haven't had to face since the Second World War.
Just on that note, talking about Ukrainians, I guess we're all sort of amazed by the ability and strength in the resistance. And I was thinking a little bit while reading your book, because you have, of course, the Zelensky chapter, and he has made a huge impression all around Europe, here as well, of course. But you also have a chapter called Horizontal, which I think was fairly interesting, which is more about society. So if you would like, what can explain this amazing resistance? Is it the fidelity to the leader, or is it more it's sort of a leading question, I guess, but you know where I'm going.
Yeah, I know where you're going. It's funny, I was really glad I did write that chapter, Horizontal, and a couple of people helped me. I mean, the core question is, why is Ukraine not Russia? I mean, we understand it's not Russia, but why is it not Russia?
Putin doesn't understand it. But
Putin doesn't understand that. But all non-psychopaths understand that Ukraine is different. It's different culturally. It's different historically, and it's different in terms of sort of social organization. And so Kurkov, he's my friend, the wonderful Ukrainian novelist.
Death and the Penguin.
Death and the Penguin, Grey Bees. He's done 2 diaries of the invasion. He's done wonderful, I don't know if they're translated into Norwegian yet, but wonderful series of Kiev mysteries. The first one in English is called The Silver Bone, which you can just devour. It's so good. It's wonderful. Anyway, he was sort of saying, that Ukrainians are basically anarchists, that they dislike their leaders. They elect a leader, as they did in the Cossack period, then they don't like their leader. And when they elected their leader, by the way, back in the 17th century, after they elected him, they pelted him with rubbish. and the point was to show that the power didn't reside with the leader, it resided with the Cossacks. That Volodymyr Yermolenko, who's a writer and a philosopher as well, was kind of explaining this to me as well, that there is something contractual about it. There's a contractual relationship between Ukrainians and their rulers. Whereas in Russia, of course, it's a vertical system, it's a patrimonial system, it's a czar, and actually, you might say a group of slaves. I mean, that sounds a bit harsh, but then you look at the number of people who are dying in this crazy war. There's something slave-like about the way they run to their doom, which I was watching, and it's and this is where Putin got it wrong, because his spy agencies told him that the Ukrainians were yearning to be liberated from their neo-Nazi masters, puppeted by the Americans, which was of course a fantasy. It was nonsense. Whereas in fact, what I saw just on a grassroots level was at the beginning of the invasion, I saw a whole load of students, for example, in Lviv, making Molotov cocktails. Instead of studying. And I sort of said to them, what's the point of making a Molotov cocktail? You're going to throw this at a Russian tank and nothing's going to happen. And this guy said, yes, but the driver will know that we hate him. And then I said, well, what are you studying? History. And I said, well, shouldn't you be studying history? He said, we are making history. No one summoned these students and said, you must go and make Molotov cocktails. No one called back the thousands of Ukrainians who came from abroad to fight and to volunteer. And even now I mean, so much of the Russian of the Ukrainian war effort against the Russians is done by volunteers. People who make drones, people, grannies who make soup. I mean, there's a sense that everybody is struggling. That Putin's not just fighting the Americans, the bogeyman in his head, and Zelensky and his regime. He's actually fighting a whole nation. And what I try and argue is that Ukraine is a nation. I describe it as a proven state. And I think the challenge now is to take Ukraine from being a proven state to being a successful state and a military victorious state. And that's where Norway and Europe come in, and where actually Norway and Europe may have to step up, depending on what happens in the US in November.
So one other description of Russia that you had, and based, I guess, on your time as a correspondent in Moscow, which was from 2007 to 2011, when they threw you out for being such a Russophobe. Anyway, it was interesting to see yesterday that the title of your book from that time, Mafia State, was picked up by the UK Minister of Defence in his speech at the United Nations.
Foreign Secretary.
It was the Foreign Secretary.
Ministry of Foreign Affairs. David
Lammy.
David Lammy. Yeah.
Right, yes, sorry. Yesterday, anyway, he was mentioning Mafia State at the Security Council meeting, I guess, yes?
He was, and to my embarrassment, I looked on Twitter today and realized he was following me and I wasn't following him, so I'm now following him,
Good to know. Of course, this is why I was asking that question. I was thinking also, that was your analysis of Russia at the time, and this thesis about the kleptocracy, you told me so. But has it now evolved? Has it changed? Has it become something more? You also say that the Tsar, for instance, is Russia changing, basically, is what I'm trying to say, because Russia, you write about this.
Russia's definitely changed, and not for the better, but certainly when I was there, the conclusion I drew, partly from observation, partly from my encounters of the secret state, the guys who kept on breaking into my family apartment and bugging it, following me around all the time.
They were giving you sort of an education, weren't they, that you employed in all the next books, basically?
Well, they gave me some great material from Mafia State. I mean, which was a form of literary revenge, I suppose you might say. But there were sort of two projects going on, I would say. One was kleptocracy. The people at the top of the Russian state were all billionaires, and they were stealing as much money as they could. And it was Kremlin Inc. And Putin already by that period was, I think, the richest guy in the world. I mean, and it was interesting, the notion of money. In other words, you don't need to physically own something. You don't need 5 billion in your bank account if you can pick up the phone and instrumentalize 10 billion, which is basically the oligarch's wealth was kind of Putin's wealth, which he could deploy for political projects, or for operational stuff, or for personal, yachts, palaces, and so on. So there was that. There was the money, but also there was this
revisionist idea of making Russia great again, actually, and an obsession with what Russia calls its near abroad, former Soviet countries. At that point, Georgia and Estonia were kind of most hated. And I covered the war in Georgia for The Guardian in 2008 when Russia sort of briefly invaded. But also Ukraine. Putin was always obsessed with Ukraine. He was always obsessed with Ukraine. But, back then it was definitely authoritarian. But you could still demonstrate against the regime. Possibly you'd be arrested, possibly something nasty would happen to you, but it was possible. Now none of that has happened. I mean, Russia has become totalitarian, where all dissent is a crime, where a guy recently was jailed for 5.5 years after he was stopped on the street by, I think, a Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty reporter who just asked him whether he supported the war, and he said he didn't, in a vox pop, just a kind of 1-minute comment. He got 5.5 years in jail. So it's turning into this great, slightly ramshackle North Korea, and plus forming strategic alliances with what you might call unwanted countries, so Iran, North Korea, China, Brazil. I mean, they recently came up with a peace plan, and I think the kind of the geopolitical contours of our century. I mean, Anne Applebaum, the historian and author, just published a book called Autocracy Inc., where she divides the world into rival camps between the Europeans, democracies, and this ideologically promiscuous group of kind of anti-democratic states that share tips and techniques on propaganda, on disinformation, on surveillance, that have financial ties and so on.
Collusion, to mention another.
Well, collusion. I mean, are we going to? Do you want to talk about the orange guy or not?
We might go there, but just going back to Russia a little bit, because one of your chapters here is called "The Captive Mind," which is a title borrowed from Czesław Miłosz. Great book about how resistance and cooperation, basically, with the authoritarian regime in Poland. How people deal with crazy stuff and still try to maintain a sense about their own selves and so on. So that is a chapter about propaganda, partly, as I noted. Because I was just wondering, I mean, when this war started 2.5 years ago, would you expect Russia to be able to take the type of losses they're taking and the changes in society that they have faced, and to see like Putin cheerful on top of all of this after all this time? Or are you surprised?
No, I'm not surprised, because I think, I mean, it's not that I'm graced with some sort of special power to see inside Putin's head, but I've lived there. I wrote a book called Shadow State as well. That was my most recent book in Norwegian, and I think the category error that some analysts, some Western politicians make is that Emmanuel Macron, for example, made in the run-up to the war, is to think that if you sit down with Putin, Macron was flying to Moscow, he was shuttling between Moscow and Kiev. He thought, I, Emmanuel Macron, am, I'm another Charles de Gaulle. I am brilliant. I am clever. I am charming. I am charismatic. I can use my sort of personal power and charisma to move Vladimir Putin to a point that we can
Nicolas Sarkozy played a role in ending the war in Georgia in 2008.
Exactly. And if Sarkozy can do it, I can do it, of course. And what he could have called me up, and I would have said, Emmanuel, don't get on the plane. No point. No point. We're already going down this dark path, because as one British diplomat put it to me, when I went back to London after having a series of break-ins at our apartment in Moscow, and I said, what the hell is going on? He said, the problem with the Russians is they don't think the way we think they should think. Are you with me? They don't think the way we think they should think. And Putin doesn't think, oh, if I invade Ukraine, it's going to be bad for my economy. No one will talk to me internationally. Maybe I'll be, there'll be an arrest warrant from the International Criminal Court. He is thinking in messianic terms that he, Vladimir Vladimirovich, is this great redeemer, this great restorer who will bring back together Belarus, Ukraine, Russia, this 9th, 10th, 11th century spiritual, cultural, unity as he sees it, and other considerations are irrelevant. It doesn't matter what happens internationally. It doesn't matter how many Russians are killed. That this is a sacred task. He's sent by history, and also he looks around the room at the other people who might take over from him. He looks at Dmitry Medvedev, this drunken midget, incompetent and crazy. He looks at Sergei Narishkin, the guy he bawled out, shouted at on the eve of the invasion, his foreign intelligence chief, and he thinks, they can't do it. It has to be me. So he's partly a man in a hurry. He's partly a man on a mission. And he's also someone who, again, I'm not a psychologist, but you can see that he has no empathy. He doesn't care how many Ukrainians he kills, of course. The Ukrainians can embrace Russia or be exterminated. Those are the options. But he doesn't care how many Russians he kills.
Yeah, but I was thinking about like society. Would you have expected like a stronger reaction against this, what we perceive as craziness, because we we still think like we probably shouldn't do, but in Russian society?
No, because you mentioned propaganda. Propaganda works. It worked in the 1930s. It worked in Mao's China. It works now, and most Russians kind of believe, perhaps not completely, what they see on Russian TV, that this is a defensive war, it's a patriotic war, instigated not by Putin but by the West and the evil Americans and so on, and they believe it because to not believe it means you realize that actually it's the 1930s and you are the guys cheering Hitler, because Putin is the most Hitler-like dictator we've had for a long time, certainly in Europe. And so it's easier to believe the fairy tale, and even clever Russians believe the fairy tale. Unfortunately, it's not just the ignorant masses; it's quite educated people, and the idea, this trope of Russian victimhood, is so powerful that Russia is an eternal victim. It's the author of nothing. It's endlessly. It's there's this phrase in Russian: "Zerkalnaya ответ." Zerkalnaya ответ, which is a mirror response. It's like, no, we are just responding to bad acts by our enemies. We don't do anything, and it's a lie. It's a dark lie, but it's a very powerful lie.
Before going back to Russia, I wanted to make a small detour among some of your other books. And in 2011, you wrote about Julian Assange and his war on secrecy, and about WikiLeaks. And of course, you covered this for The Guardian. And a couple of years later, you wrote about Edward Snowden and his revelations. I guess that was also a phone call you got, or one of your colleagues from him at some point. And you describe him so interestingly, like this vampire-like guy who kind of comes up out of the crypt with all this material that he did give you. I'd like to, if you could tell a little bit about the work with the books, but also about the legacy of those at that time whistleblowers, but now maybe figures of more, how to put it politely, controversy.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, Julian Assange. We worked with him on a series of releases. He released a whole lot of
State Department
well, there was Iraq logs and Afghanistan logs and State Department cables, and I looked at these and wrote a front page story for The Guardian, which they headlined "Inside Putin's Mafia State," and I think, I don't quite know, but this was possibly the final straw which led to me being kicked out of the country, the first Western reporter to be thrown out of Russia since the Cold War. But Julian fell out with The Guardian fairly soon after that, and he fell out with me, and he fell out with everybody, and he's a complicated character. Let's leave it at that.
But we do meet him again in your book Collusion a little bit.
Well, I mean, the thing is that the charges against him for leaking in 2011 have been dropped, and I think that's absolutely right. I mean, I think what he did then was journalism. What is more tricky is what happened in 2015 and 2016, where WikiLeaks were the recipients of hacked democratic emails, which were stolen by Russian military intelligence with the goal of helping Donald Trump win the election and basically sabotaging Hillary Clinton. And actually that worked. As an espionage operation, it was probably the most successful in the history of Soviet and Russian espionage. I mean, because the margins were so close, and the American media ran with the emails. So, I mean, I found that troubling.
Right, yeah, and Edward Snowden is now sitting in Moscow and using X quite a lot, which is actually banned in Russia, I guess. But
yeah, again, tricky because what Snowden leaked to us, I mean, bear in mind he leaked this material to journalists, and we didn't pay him for it, showed the extent to which surveillance in the 21st century has become universal, and that states know, or potentially know everything. I mean, so that this life phone I've got in my pocket, it pings every 2 seconds to a radio tower, and all of the geolocation data, all of the web searches, everything you do is collected omnisciently and stored. And it's a system of what you might call mass pre-criminal surveillance. In other words, you strike me as a nice guy, but maybe you're not a nice guy. Maybe back on your laptop you're doing nasty things. The point is, all of that is being collected, and if you then do something stupid, then all of that data is available. And what Snowden did was to open up a conversation about where the boundaries between privacy and these tech-driven state powers lie. And I think he's an interesting character, someone who came from the libertarian right. But I have to say, I find the fact that he's in Moscow is clearly not great, and the fact that his mental world seems to be quite close to that of Elon Musk's is also not great.
It's more troubling with Elon Musk than with Edward Snowden right now, maybe. But
for sure, because Musk has got a lot more power.
Then we come to your books, A Very Expensive Poison. I remember I met the main, or not the main character, but the victim of that book. He came to the Helsinki Committee some 20 years ago.
That's right, we talked about that. Yeah. When I saw you. Yeah.
So he was here at one time, but then he died in 2006, poisoned, of course, a very expensive poison.
Murdered by Putin.
Murdered by Putin. Yeah. And then it was your book, Collusion. It's also partly based on the Christopher Steele dossier. That's
true. Yeah.
Maybe you can tell a little bit about that. And then, but I just want to say that and the Shadow State. All of these books somehow are about Russia's operations, covert or not so covert, in the West. And I was wondering, over this time, do you see kind of a change in the West about how we are able to understand and interpret this type of?
Yeah, I mean, I think so, but it's just taken so long. That this is the problem. That actually there's been a relatively small group of commentators and writers, journalists, people like yourself, who have been warning about the fact that Russia's ambition, Russia's not just merely another nasty state that beats up anti-government protesters and puts them in a big van with bars on it. That actually it's a disruptive power. It's a power that wants to break European borders, to devour Ukraine, and I think to keep going. I mean, Putin will keep going so long as he is able to. So whether his next target is Moldova, or, I mean, he's re-clientized Georgia, he's soft annexed Belarus, he hates the Baltics, he hates Poland, he looks at Kaliningrad, this exclave, and you look on a map, it's only 70 kilometers from Russia to Kaliningrad through Lithuania. He wants to kind of restore the sort of kind of empire that the Soviet Union enjoyed. I mean, I do think that is his plan. And what I was saying before, we don't think they think the way we think they should think. That for too long has driven various considerations have driven European policy. So if you look at Germany became addicted to Russian gas and believed that if you traded with the Russians, then democracy would come.
That this Ostpolitik, basically.
Yeah, this vector, and Scholz in his head, God bless him, still seems to think he can't be too nasty to Russia, the Second World War, etc. Not really fully understanding that what is happening in Ukraine is Russian fascism, and that Germany is especially
should be against that,
obliged
probably,
to fight fascism and to give Ukraine tourist missiles and everything. But at the same time, I look at my country, but I love Germany, I speak German, I was based there as a correspondent. Look at my country, and we rolled out the red carpet for Russian oligarchs. We allowed them to buy British passports. We allowed them to buy our football teams, Chelsea. We allowed them to buy our real estate so that I can't even afford to live in London. I write all these successful books, but it's still beyond my beyond my financial means to live in London.
Just stay here in Oslo.
Stay here. Well, I stay here in Oslo. Maybe the state will help me. I don't know. But and so our mistake was to, and also our newspapers.
Yeah.
I mean,
Lord Lebedev.
Yeah, I don't know if you know, but we have someone called Yevgeny Lebedev. Alexander Lebedev was a KGB operative, foreign intelligence operative, at the Soviet embassy in Kensington in West London in the late 1980s, and then reinvented himself as a sort of tycoon. And his playboy son, Yevgeny, became the owner of the Evening Standard and boosted Boris Johnson, boosted Brexit, and was rewarded with the title of Lord Lebedev of Siberia. Sits in the House of Lords. I mean, it would be a kind of funny, darkly comic novel.
Sounds like something like from The Thick of It.
It sounds like something like
Minister
Jonathan
or whatever.
Coe would write, not a British novelist. But it's true, and it's a scandal. And Russian connected people gave millions of pounds to the Conservative Party, supported Brexit, which is one of the things I explore in Shadow State is the Russians pushed Trump, they also pushed Brexit. So just one other thing, which is that these Russian spies, and their spy masters, they are not brilliant. They're actually a bit rubbish, but they have this kind of they have this sort of, they're opportunists. So they'll compile let's say a psychological profile of everyone in the audience. Then they'll find someone, then they'll try that, then they'll try someone else. They'll try. It's like throwing mud at a wall. You throw enough mud, some of it sticks. And so they're not brilliant, but they're quite good at spotting flaws and divisions in our societies and trying to exploit them. So we shouldn't overestimate them, but nor should we underestimate them. And I think for too long we underestimated them.
Right. I think also your friend Roy has some of your books in Norwegian that will be probably able, I assume, that one can buy them if you happen to be here, and Roy maybe you would even sign them.
Roy is doing a classic British thumbs up in the background. Yeah.
So it means yes, that will happen after we've finished with this. But I think I will turn to the audience now, but to give them time to think. I like. Can
I ask you one question quickly?
Is this how it's going to?
Am I allowed to do that? Just tell us. Do me 2 minutes on your book, The Warlord. Why did you call your book The Warlord? About Vladimir Putin.
Well, turning on the table. But no, I did so because I think that war is fundamental to how he thinks and how he operates, and I think it's important to his persona. How he is promoted by the Kremlin, going to Chechnya on a fighter jet in 1999. That basically is who he is. That will kill the terrorists in the outhouse and this. So the warrior is central to him. And then I think that he is a guy marked by trauma that are common in Russia from the Second World War, from the siege of Leningrad, from the fact that
his brother died, right?
His brother died, and a lot of other relatives died, and actually his parents are sort of miracle type survivors. I mean, you cannot, of course, completely trust these sources because the one source about the family story is basically him, and he is a very well-known liar, but But the fact that he comes from a line of survivors, and he's a survivor himself, and somehow a child of war. He has 3 parents: his mother, father, and the war, basically.
Yeah.
And he also thinks, it seems from what he writes and what he says, that war is not kind of an aberration, something strange, something which is abnormal, which most of us would think, but that somehow that isn't the state of things. That is an honest situation. So he always tells this story, used to tell this story about when his father was fighting outside of Leningrad, and he meets a German. And they look at each other, and then the German is faster. He throws a grenade at Putin, Vladimir Senior, the father of Putin. So he lies there very heavily wounded in the snow, and then he is rescued. But the father then is often quoted by President Putin saying that war is a simple and vicious, cruel thing, a simple and cruel thing. It's all about throwing the grenade first, basically. So I think that was why, and I was calling it the warlord. I mean, yes, there could have been the mafioso, the Vorsakonia, whatever. There could have been many Putins. There are many Putins, but the warlord is well. That's why we're sitting here, basically.
Yeah, it's a good analysis, and I agree. I suspect the story about his father was invented, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
But it speaks to a kind of psychological truth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, exactly. But the myths are interesting in themselves.
Exactly. Yeah.
I will open up. But since you have this prophetic vision, obviously, what did I tell you, and so on? I'd like to ask you just one final question,
okay.
A small one.
Sure.
What do you think will come out of this war that we are in now? For Russia, for Ukraine, and for Europe. So, like, what's at stake?
I mean, everything is at stake. The future of the 21st century is at stake, and which model, the sort of the band of dictator autocrats and wannabe dictators like Trump, whether that model prevails, which is
the Oligarchy Inc.
Well, Oligarchy Inc., but sort of Despots Inc., or whether actually the democratic model of believing in international law, believing in self-determination, believing in just in decency, human decency, whether that vision prevails. I don't know what the outcome is yet. The war will not finish this year. It will not finish next year. If Donald Trump comes back, then the Ukrainians will lose even more rapidly in the east of Ukraine, and it's possible they'll be forced into some peace, which won't be a peace, because Putin is determined. His war goals are unchanged. He wants to conquer the whole of Ukraine. I don't think he can do that. I don't think he has that capacity, and I think that Ukraine is now. I mean, and Putin's complained that Ukraine was an anti-Russian project, became an anti-Russian project. It was Putin who made it an anti-Russian project by annexing Crimea and by waging a hate campaign against Ukraine over several decades. So
created a nation.
So in a way, he's been this great recruiter for NATO. You might even argue that he's been the greatest Ukrainian nationalist, because what he's done is he's consolidated the country, and Russia has lost Ukraine forever. And you would hope that Europe has gained Ukraine. I mean, both as a future member of the European Union, but as something integrated. And to be clear, Kiev, for those of you who haven't been there, it's not some, grimy Soviet hell. It's a kind of modern, flourishing city with really good cafes, with great coffee, better than Norwegian coffee. Can I say that? Okay. And annoying hipsters on bikes who knock you over on the pavement. An artisanal pizza, and basically it's completely integrating with the West. The younger generation, absolutely are looking in this direction, and so I think that is Ukraine's trajectory for the next decades. And with Russia, I'm not a soothsayer. I don't know what's going to happen, but my sense is the regime is more fragile than it seems. And Putin's plan is to live forever, by the way. I can reveal this exclusively. He wants to live eternally. Also, there's quite an interesting conversation about how many Putins there are. There's quite a lot of evidence that he employs several doubles, and the double has a day off and another double takes his place. You've got the triple. You've got the Putin who, sits 40 yards away from everybody, and then you've got this Putin who will suddenly plunge into crowds in Dagestan and hug everybody, and that's shot from behind. That's clearly anyway. So were Putin to die, how would you know? I think I would know if Dmitry Peskov, Putin's press spokesman, who always lies, denied that Putin was dead. Then I would know that he was dead. But at some point what I'm saying is there will be not a system change in Russia, but there'll be a kind of personnel change. And I can see a situation at some point where everything will come tumbling down. I'm not saying it's inevitable, but I think it's possible.
Good. We have some more minutes before the books are being signed. I see one hand, Steinar. I think maybe Sarah will come with a mic for you so that people listening in can hear. Trenger ikke å ta den på.
Yes, thank you very much. Very interesting talk. I have a question about the mood in Ukraine. In your book, Invasion, you met many people, or you write about meetings with many people all over the country. And there was a lot of fighting spirit. People were convinced that, they said, we are going to win, we will prevail. Now you've just been there. Is there still some fighting spirit left? Or has there been, or is there, can you notice some fatigue?
Yeah, I mean, the belief in victory is still there, but fatigue is also there, and the mood is grim and pretty gloomy. I mean, if you'd asked me this 3 months ago, I would have said it's very gloomy. What happened in Kursk? We haven't talked about Kursk. Ukraine's invasion into Russia, which nobody had on their bingo card. I don't know if you saw that coming. I interviewed General Alexander Syrskyi, the commander-in-chief of Ukraine's armed forces, in July. I was the first foreign journalist to get an interview with him. And Syrskyi told me back then, I said, how are you going to get back Crimea? What are you going to do? You're kind of losing the war. And he said, I have a plan. And I thought, oh, that's just what generals say when they meet Western reporters, I have a plan. But it turned out he did have a plan, because 10 days later he invaded Russia after we met. And so that has kind of pushed the mood up a bit. And I think it's showed international partners that actually, with the right equipment and the right circumstances, Ukraine can do incredible things. Same with its long-range drones, which last week blew up 2 massive ammunition dumps inside Russia.
Yeah, that was significant.
So every time you think, oh, it's completely hopeless, Ukraine is just losing, they will do something extraordinary. It's the problem is that in 2022, I knew a lot of people who were fighting. I had friends who, and now everybody knows someone who's died, and not just someone they know from far away. So, a brother, a friend, a classmate, a lover, a son, a grandson, and civilians are being killed every night by Russian bombs, just landing on residential districts of Kharkiv or Lviv or Zaporizhia or Donetsk Oblast. So people are exhausted, the troops are exhausted, and I think Zelensky wants to bring the war to a close. He's talking in the UN General Assembly. He spoke today. And when I saw him on Friday, he was talking about a just peace and he didn't tell us precisely what it involved, but it involved permission to carry out long-range strikes using Western weapons on Russian military targets, which Washington is refusing. Joe Biden is refusing to allow this. Involved economic assistance, which is maybe where Norway could come in. Involving Kursk, possibly as some kind of trade. So people want the war to end, but they also recognize that if Ukraine stops fighting, then Russia will just take everything. So it's hard. It's hard, but life goes on. Actually, people fall in love. People drink. Last week I was at a wake, I missed the funeral of someone who was killed, and I went to the kind of party with friends of theirs, and you drink, and you toast, and you cry, and you hug, and you carry on. And Ukraine is carrying on, and Ukraine won't stop. Ukraine can't stop, and everyone understands that.
So one big event coming up that will shape these developments, I guess, is the U.S. presidential election, and yes, the orange guy and the relationship with Putin. You know what could happen then, and why this attitude that he has towards Russia, which was visible even just a few days ago. He was saying something that, well, Napoleon couldn't make it, nobody can make it against Russia.
Apart from the fact that Russia lost the Cold War and lost the war with Japan and has lost various wars. But Trump is not a student of history. He's not really a student of anything. I mean, so when I saw Zelensky on Friday, Zelensky told me that he would meet with Biden and with Harris. He was trying to meet with Trump. The teams are in contact. Clearly, Trump does not want to meet Zelensky because the latest is that they were due to meet tomorrow. It seems they're not meeting tomorrow. Trump is not available. So if Trump becomes president, then it's pretty clear what will happen. He will call Putin, say, I'll give you Ukraine, you keep what you've got, but stop fighting. And then he'll say, take this deal. And when Zelensky says, well, I can't, allow Russia to occupy 20% of my country and to treat Ukrainians in those territories brutally, then he'll say, well, we're cutting off all assistance to you. That's how it will go. And then, it'll be interesting to see what Europe's response is. But Ukraine will carry on fighting, but from a position of significant weakness. I mean, my view on Trump is that he's a Russian asset, and you can define asset in different ways, witting, unwitting. But my book Collusion goes all the way back to 1987 when Trump visited Moscow for the first time, and he attracted the attention of the KGB as someone who might be useful. And I'm not saying that he prances around in a Russian general's uniform, in his spare time, but he's clearly compromised by Russia. He has extensive financial ties with Russia going back several decades. He admires Putin as the kind of strongman that he himself would like to be. So there's a degree of envy there. And he's the most pro-Kremlin president America has ever had. And all of the people who have sent me abuse saying, collusion, what collusion, on Twitter over the years, how do they explain the fact that Trump keeps on repeating Kremlin talking points? I mean, and even if you take the view that there's no formal association between him and Moscow, the fact is that the Russian state have identified him as the person who will do most damage to America, will discredit and possibly destroy its democracy, spoil relations with the Europeans, the troublesome Norwegians and Nordic countries and the awful Brits and so on. He's an agent of chaos. They want him to win. They're helping him to win. And they believe that if he wins, then all sorts of things will be possible next year.
Just the compromised. What is the? I mean, the economic ties are pretty open. The investments in Florida by the Russian billionaires and so on. This is out in the open. But the compromised, it still goes back to like footage of some strange things in the Moscow hotel, or.
I mean, there's all sorts of stuff. But look, I don't work for the KGB. But I can tell you that the Donald Trump file would. Is this your office here, by the way? it would not fit in your. You haven't got enough space for the Trump file, but there will be transcripts of what he said in 1987 when he was staying in a hotel next to Red Square, which would have been bugged. There will be records of his encounters with various Russian women. Some of which may have been consensual, some may have been more commercial. Let's say. We know from a bipartisan Senate Intelligence Committee report, which came out after the Steele dossier. Everyone beats up on the Steele dossier, which pointed out that the Ritz-Carlton Hotel, where Trump stayed in November of 2013 for the Miss World beauty pageant, was run by the FSB, and they had cameras in guest bedrooms. And there was an FSB, spy permanently on duty in the hotel. This is all in the congressional report. So the point is, there are multiple Donald Trump tapes. Now, whether they show Donald Trump in Moscow having a cup of chamomile tea, reading a difficult French novel, or whether it shows him indulging in some more exotic
you put
pleasures.
it like this.
You know, we don't know. But the point is that Putin knows, and Trump knows that Putin knows, and Putin doesn't have to. You know, it's enough for them to explain. For it to explain why the Russians have some leverage. I wouldn't say they've got total leverage over Donald Trump. I suspect no one does, but some leverage over Trump.
Right. Okay. One more question. Two more questions. Berit first.
Three more questions. I'll be briefer. Sorry, I will make it briefer.
Yes. A couple of weeks ago, all the Nordic foreign ministers gathered in a televised debate to discuss Ukraine and the assistance to Ukraine, and you touched upon it, long-range weapon to be used inside of Russia. And then a couple of the political scientists there pointed to the possible red line of Putin. Where is the possible red line? And the way you explain Putin is, of course, extremely scary, because we cannot expect him to do what we expect. And where do you have a sort of any kind of a theory where Putin's red line would go, and to really then turn to nuclear weapon?
Yeah, I do have a theory, and it's only a theory, but I think it's a good theory. Is that I don't believe Putin's nuclear threats. I mean, Russia's just been invaded by foreign troops for the first time since Operation Barbarossa in 1942, and did he nuke the world? Did he nuke Oslo, London, Washington? No, he pretended nothing had happened. I mean, really, the Kremlin strategy has been to pretend that the Kursk thing is not really a thing. It's just a small local difficulty which will be taken care of soon. And it's not even really on the news, which is astonishing. And it's all bluff. It's bluff, 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 bluff. The Ukrainians get it. Joe Biden, unfortunately, is still a believer in the bluff. And his thinking was shaped by by the 1970s, by meeting Gromyko, the Soviet foreign minister, more than 50 years ago. And my sort of Putin nuke theory is this: is that the defining image of Putin is, if I'm Putin, you would not be allowed to sit there. You would have to sit by the fire extinguisher at the end of a long table about 30 meters away. And Putin doesn't care how many people he kills. But he does care about his own personal survival. And his spy chiefs come and see him every week and say, Vladimir Vladimirovich, we have foiled another plot by the American Special Services to kill you. Hurrah. And he believes this. And so the reason he's not going to unleash a nuclear conflict is that he is worried the Americans will drop a bomb on his bald head. And that's what he cares about. And ultimately, he's quite cowardly. He's not a brave person. He's a cowardly person. As Alexei Navalny put it, he's a cowardly little man in a bunker. So I think that is what's saving us. And really, we just need to get over the nuclear stuff and arm Ukraine and let them use long-range missiles and give them everything they can to defeat Russia.
Next up is Jon.
I'll keep my question short and rather in a free form, but I'm thinking about another election that is coming up very soon in Georgia. I mean, what are your thoughts about what this is about?
Yeah, it's very. I mean, I haven't been to Georgia for a while, but the last time I was there, I actually met Ivanishvili, the leader of Georgian Dream, the Georgian oligarch, all of whose money is basically in Russia. It's Russian money. And Ivanishvili lives in this, I can only describe it as a kind of Bond, baddie, villain castle overlooking Georgia. I mean, it's incredible. He's got various replicas of sculptures that he's bought costing millions of dollars, which are actually in Swiss vaults, but the replicas are there in his Bond evil baddie palace. And what he's done, I mean, I think I used the word re-clientized. He's basically copy-pasting legislation from Russia about LGBTQ plus, about foreign agents, and he's trying to turn Georgia into a kind of Russian clone state. And this is a country invaded by Russia in August 2008. I was there, following Russian tanks as they were driving towards Tbilisi. I think it's extremely concerning. And what's so depressing is, there's still talk about joining the European Union, about being on a European trajectory, but ultimately it's becoming a Russian colony again. And I mean, Georgia's a great country. It deserves better than Ivanishvili and his party. And I just hope that it can go back to a more democratic direction before it's too late.
And if it does that, there might be there is an election now in Georgia, on 26th of October, and if the result is rigged, which you expect it will be, then people might be angry, go on the street, and they will try to do something on the street because there is a tradition for this in Georgia, and maybe they will have some success. And at that stage,
maybe not.
And at that stage, if they have some success, what will Russia do, you think?
Well, the thing is, you can see a scenario developing where it's a bit like with Viktor Yanukovych and the Maidan in winter 2013, spring 2014, where there were these peaceful demonstrators, anti-government demonstrators, and then the regime of Yanukovych got more and more brutal, and then essentially under pressure from Putin and Russia, Yanukovych's security detail or possibly Russian snipers shot dead 100 people, and then he fled. And then the rest we know, and you can see a scenario where the Russian political technologists try and work their dark magic. It doesn't work, or they cheat too blatantly. There are street protests, and then I don't know what will happen. I mean, that'll be the crunch moment, whether Georgian government uses force under pressure from Moscow, or whether your Georgian government retreats. But it could get very nasty. But I'm absolutely certain that the Russians will help the ruling party cheat, because that's what they do.
Right. Yeah. That is to be expected. So
that is to be expected.
Are you going there?
I'm not actually sure I would go there anymore.
Right.
I mean, I don't know, but there are a lot of Russian spies in Georgia. It's a very active espionage center for them, and I'm not sure the current government would help me if I got into trouble.
True, very, very true, probably. But thanks a lot, Luke. It is just great to have you here. One of the really great people sitting in just this chair.
Not at all.
Tsikhanovskaya was here just a few weeks ago, and so you're in this. You're in that company.
And can I just thank you for your important work that you've done? I mean, you mentioned some of the previous speakers you've had here, but it's more important than ever. And I sort of think, I say to people watching is, don't turn off the TV. I mean, let's continue to focus on Ukraine, continue to help Ukraine. Support Ukraine and carry on doing what you're doing.
Thank you. And thank you all.
Thank you.